Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist, and today I am joined by Halli Carbrey. Halli, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeremy.
I'm excited to talk. We run in the same religious trauma circles on Instagram.
Yes, we do.
And like your story is really unique, I think. So I'm excited. Your story is very common in some ways and very unique in other ways.
That
So
is
I'm excited.
accurate.
I'm excited to talk about it. My starting question is always, how'd you get into the mental health field?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was growing up, I always wanted to be an English teacher. So that's what I thought I was going to be. Of course, life had a different direction for me. I actually had an amazing English teacher in high school. Shout out to Mr. Potter. And
Mr. Potter.
and he was my English teacher for 2 years in high school. And he actually said to me at one point, he goes, "You are a good writer, and I think you really love, books, but I don't actually think literature is your interest. I think it's actually the characters, understanding what makes people tick and understanding humanity." And so I shifted gears at that point, and because I think he was dead on. And then, of course, I had the interesting journey of pursuing psychology in a very conservative fundamentalist space.
Yeah.
I was warned by many people in that group that I was with that I would be really getting into some dangerous territory if I were to focus so much on the mind, as they called it. And so I, against all odds, I guess you can say, decided to do it anyway. And so I got a bachelor's in psychology, and this is a part of my story as well, but I actually did a minor in gender studies and a minor in sociology. And without really knowing at the time, those two minors were actually very much probably the beginnings of my deconstruction process. I don't know, for those of you who don't know, deconstruction is essentially like we had our belief system sort of constructed for us as we grew up, and then essentially we look at, what is my belief system even constructed of? Let me take these pieces apart and look at them and examine them. So that began that process for me. And then I went on to pursue a master's in counseling from a seminary, from Moody Theological Seminary. And that was an interesting experience as well. Ironically, it was also a part of my deconstruction journey.
Sure.
Because a lot of what I was learning did not add up with what I had actually been taught growing up. And also I got to see so many different expressions of Christianity that I had never been exposed to before. And people believed a myriad of different things about the Bible. And so it was interesting to see, oh, this person believes a radically different sort of translation of this verse or of this idea, this concept. And so, ironically, going to seminary, I'm sure this is a part of people's story, actually more common than we think, but began to really, I talk about deconstruction for me in this way. It's almost like whack-a-mole. There were just questions and doubts and thoughts that came up often in my life, and I would just whack them down. I would just push them down for many reasons, but ultimately I did get my degree from a seminary, and then I was in private practice with some colleagues of mine from the seminary for just about a year, when I realized that the work that I actually wanted to do, I was working with couples mostly. And so then at that point, I realized, wow, like most couples are struggling in the area of sex and intimacy. And I did not have the tools that I needed to help those couples. I had always been interested in sex and sexuality and didn't shy away from taking, classes in college about like
Mhm.
human sexual behavior and so on and so forth. And then my degree in gender studies also sort of lent itself to that interest as well. And then I pursued 32 weeks of post-grad training from the Institute for Relational Intimacy, run by an amazing woman named Martha Copey. Shout out to Martha. I guess we're doing shout outs.
Yeah, for sure. Love it.
And that really began another sort of layer of my deconstruction process, because I was then
Yeah.
forced to reckon with, oh, wow, these things that I've been taught about sex and desire and premarital sex, and all of these things. It's like, wait a minute, sexual development actually really should begin before marriage. And I can see
Mhm.
the impact of it not beginning, and just as a little example. So now
Yeah.
I practice mostly as a relationship and sex therapist, and it's really where I thrive. I absolutely love talking about the subject that for many people is somewhat of a taboo
Yeah.
subject, and it feels like really invigorating and interesting and fun and satisfying for me. And it's funny, like, I tell people about my work and they're like, how were your clients today? And I'm like, my client had an orgasm. Not in the treatment
Yeah.
room, but you know,
Right.
that's what I do now, and that's sort of my journey of how I became a therapist.
Yeah. Um, which is fascinating. There's so much in there that I want to dig into.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and go in chronological order. We'll see how I do. Did you
Sure.
go to like a conservative college for undergrad?
No, I actually went to a public university in
Yeah.
Buffalo, New York for
So I
that.
was I was I was curious because I don't know how many parochial or religious schools are going to have gender studies as a minor.
Totally.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I grew up conservative Christian as well, evangelical. My family, both my parents are teachers, and so education was highly prized in our family. So I think it was like, I don't want to say a double-edged sword, but like I was going to a top university in the country, and my parents were like glad about that because I was a good student. So I think it was the conservative part of like, oh, you're not going to one of the like Lutheran schools that you got into. They all accepted you because you're smart. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm gonna go to the big university that has all this name recognition. Like that's what I'm gonna do. And so I
Right.
think that like pushback from the conservative upbringing for me, I didn't get as much of it just
Mhm.
because my parents were interested in like, yeah, education is good. So go get
Yeah.
a good education.
Right. Well, I was raised in, a sect of Christianity, but the one that I was raised in, I actually refer to as a cult.
Hmm.
Many people haven't heard of the specific group that I was with. And it's interesting. I'm just sort of noticing my feelings as I'm talking about it. I still have a bit of like fear that surfaces when I think of mentioning the name
Yeah.
um, of the cult. But it was a very unique, as you mentioned earlier. My experience has some commonality to many people's experience who are healing from religious trauma and so on. But my experience was also very unique in some senses.
Yeah.
The cults that I was with had what I refer to as like a charismatic narcissistic leader.
Hmm.
And, even just as an example of that, he went so far as to translate the Bible on his own. And then we used his translation of the Bible exclusively. Like, we were not really meant to be reading any other version. It was thought of as like less than.
Sure.
And also his translation had like at the top of the page, there would be like maybe half or less of the page would be actual scripture. And then the bottom half of the page would be his commentary or footnotes.
Sure.
So just like right on the same page as scripture were his thoughts. And so it was almost like, how can your psyche help but to not equate the two?
Right.
And so many other examples of how sort of twisted my experience of Christianity was.
Hmm.
We were really taught that we were sort of this elite brand of
Sure.
Christianity, and I'm sure like many denominations think of themselves as the right one,
Yeah.
but we were really taught that in a unique sense so much so that sort of other believers didn't understand the full truth. They didn't
Yeah.
have the so-called highest revelation.
Yeah.
And yet, a huge part of the doctrine that was taught to us was that we are all one,
Hmm.
as believers. And we, the idea that there should be oneness in the body of Christ was like such a emphasized dogma that it was very confusing
Yeah.
at how other believers were less than, didn't have the sort of oracle of God that we had. So how could they
Hmm.
possibly have the highest truth and so on? And yet we're all supposed to be one with them. But they were welcome to us. We
Yeah.
would not go to them.
Right.
And such is sort of one of many examples of the cognitive dissonance required to maintain that
Yeah.
in that belief system.
Yeah. I talk a lot about religious thought control. I mean,
Mhm.
information control, I think, is a big part of how Christianity operates. I
Yeah.
think your story, and I've listened to you on some different podcasts talking
Yeah.
about the cult that you grew up in, is I think one of severity, because it's like the charismatic leader and the Bible translation. But like that's I grew up with that without the charismatic leader. Like I grew up in a small Lutheran sect, like the most conservative one that exists, and like they have their own translation because the NIV was like bad, so they were gonna get something different. And
Oh,
like
that
it,
silly little loose translation of NIV, and don't
I know.
talk about the Message translation.
Um, but like, right, that idea of like people can come to our church and join us, but we can't go to them. Like they're gonna go to heaven and we'll celebrate with them someday, but like they're not, we shouldn't pray with them because that could damage our souls. And like just
Yeah.
this like constant, like you said, cognitive dissonance, and it's in group out group biases. So like
Mhm.
Christians are better than like non-believers, but also like we're the best, most specialist Christians. And it's very like uh I think shifting sounds on purpose so that you keep kind of latching on to your brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, they play into, our need as human beings, or our supposed need as human beings for certainty and safety. And so
Hmm.
when someone is purporting to have the answer, or to know the truth, or to have the right group, and so on and so forth, especially as we're growing up, that sense of certainty, is so helpful in a sense, even though it's not actual certainty. It feels like it. And so that
Yeah.
sort of keeps us feeling safe and grounded, and we're with the right people. So we're in the safe group. We get to go, to heaven, and all of that. But really, so much of life is about tolerating uncertainty.
Yeah.
So much of life is uncertain.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's been interesting. I had several, I would say, like, pivotal experiences with deconstruction. And it's interesting. I actually, as a therapist, started out working mostly with Christian clients.
Hmm.
And so then when I deconstructed, that became quite an issue, because I felt very conflicted and torn about working with people who were still, in a fundamentalist mindset. Because of course I knew it very well, just
Right.
like I, should be well acquainted with many different belief systems of clients that I was
Hmm.
working with in order to accurately provide care to them. But of course, and this is the interesting thing about, like, your therapist needs therapy, is like, I I had to go through so much turmoil, inner turmoil, and turmoil in my life, and so much therapy of my own, and understanding what is religious trauma, how
Hmm.
how is this affecting me, and then of course triggers coming up with my own clients, sometimes. And I still deal with that a little bit, actually, to this day, but mostly I feel very well equipped to be in a treatment room with someone who has radically different beliefs than I do, even though I used to hold similar beliefs.
Sure.
Maintain, my sense of professionalism and tactfulness and calm, really. So it's
Yeah.
sort of like exposure therapy in a way.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, here we go. Exposed to someone who is very fundamentalist, but I'm over here with my
Hmm.
own set of beliefs and feelings and experiences and my own journey, and they're over there, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually anti-fundamentalist
Right.
in a way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know if I remember your original question. I was just sort of talking
No,
there.
that's good. And I think that's interesting as therapists who begin their careers and then deconstruct after, because I've talked to both. I've talked to people who do I would say the stereotypical, which they deconstruct during college.
Mhm.
And my story is again, like there's a lot of overlap with everybody I talk to who's deconstructed, because I think there are just some common experiences. But like for me, deconstruction was 20 years. Like as a
Wow.
10-year-old, I had like serious doubts, but like not wasn't intellectually in a place where I could actually engage with them. And so it was just like that, like talk to your pastor, pat on the head. Like I didn't want to go to heaven when I was 10. I was like, that sounds terrible. And I don't want to sing forever. I'm not musically gifted. And I was like, that sounds terrible. Um, but like, yeah, you have these kind of moments where like you have a lot of question or you have a lot of doubt, and kind of how that gets responded to is I think um helpful or hurtful, honestly. And so you can stay in it a lot longer as somebody who, like, for me, I worked at a Christian counseling place. That was the start of my
Right.
um professional career, and it was one of those things where like I think that hastened my deconstruction, because I had all this scientific knowledge about how psychology and human development, and I'm
Yeah.
a marriage therapist, so like working with couples, working with sex, and like having to spend so much time on dogma and doctrine and be like, well, like you can interpret it this way or this way, and like this is
Right.
what the science says, so like
Right.
let's go there. And it was
Right.
so weird because I was like grew up in this conservative Christian thing, and I still was a Christian at that time, but I was so like far to the liberal and progressive side that was like I didn't even fit in at my Christian counseling place, because I was like, hey, like we shouldn't pray with our clients, that's unethical. And everyone was like, but we're Christian counselors, so we should do that. I was like, nah, that's not ethical. We need
Mm-hmm.
permission for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's interesting. And then yeah, when you deconstruct, this is an interesting topic, because like it pops up for me still too, is like if you look at my resume, or if you, I don't know, it's probably out there somewhere on the internet, I don't know, but like it's all the Christian stuff. Like I was on church council, I worked at a Christian college, I worked at a Christian counseling center. Like, so Christians still find me, and like I'm pretty openly atheist now, but like it's still one of those things where that pattern, or people remember me from a couple of years ago, or they knew I worked with their friend or whatever. And it's like, how upfront do you want to be as a therapist? Like, I know the stuff, I can work with them. I used to
Yes.
work with atheists when I was a believer, and I never tried to convert anyone. So like it's a weird space, because the triggers certainly feel different.
Yes. Oh, that is so well said, and such an accurate description of my own experience too. Um, yeah, I will do sometimes if a client calls into our office and then asks for a faith-based counselor, but they really need sex therapy. And so I will sort of do a screening call with clients, and
Yeah.
I'll ask a little bit about them. And I'm absolutely open with every client that I am not a Christian and I do not provide faith-based counseling.
Hmm.
And then if they want to proceed with, me as a non-Christian therapist, even though that's what they're seeking, I will still do a little bit of a screen on my end, just to make sure that their issues or their story isn't going to be too triggering for me to be able to, that would prevent me being able to care for them well.
Yeah.
And there are some, I would say actually just one that I can think of that I had to say, I think I'm going to provide you a referral and
Hmm.
that sort of thing. Part of my deconstruction process that is so triggering for me is that I was married to a pastor, essentially.
Hmm.
In our cults, we called them full timers. They were
Okay.
full time service to God. This is
Sure.
actually a part of what made it so culty, is that we had such different language for everything.
Yeah.
And so it really, enhanced that in-group, out-group feeling. And our terms made the most sense. Our language was what distinguished us.
Yeah.
Of course, more than language too. But anyway, I'm now divorced, and my ex-husband was a full-timer. He was in
Hmm.
full-time service to God. And Unfortunately, that really caused me a lot of pain. And
Yeah.
I see him both as the victim of the system that we were in, and also, a perpetrator of the harm
Yeah.
that existed. And so it's a confusing perspective to have at
Yeah.
times. But he was raised in the cult just like I was. And but unfortunately, what the cult taught, both implicitly and explicitly, was that essentially the more that you sort of had to abandon your wife and children in service to God, the more reward there would be for that.
Yeah.
And, pulling from those verses like, he who it's funny, like verses are now hard for me to recite because I don't remember them as much as I used to. But there's
Yeah.
a verse that talks about hating your mother and father and brother and sister,
Hmm.
and some translations include wife in
Yeah.
there. It says, he who does not hate them is not worthy of me. And so
Yeah.
they really pulled from that verse and others. And so anytime, prior to having children, but we had kids pretty early on because that's just what you did.
Yep.
Prior to having children, it was hard because I felt very lonely, just profoundly lonely. We immediately moved to a new city in his service, and
Hmm.
then very soon after began having kids. And so before having kids, I was so lonely, but God needed my husband more than I did.
Yeah.
And so that was really hard to navigate, both as a wife, but also just as a human being. I
Hmm.
I couldn't quite understand why I couldn't get it together. Why
Sure.
couldn't I just experience God's grace as all sufficient? Why did I still need this human connection? And so that was a really hard time for me. And then after having kids, I just remember especially this one instance where I said, I'm having a really hard time putting our 2-year-old and our baby to bed at the same time. And he had to
Hmm.
be on many nights for meetings and so on. And I remember thinking to myself, like, God isn't down here changing diapers and wiping butts.
Yeah.
So, like, this isn't working.
Yeah.
But the message was always, and not just from my ex-husband, but also from church leaders, was like, you have an honorable calling in that your husband is in service to God, and so this is really a gift to you. You get hardship and suffering more than others, and that's a gift because you get to rely on God so much more. And so there's all this internalized shame because
Yeah.
whenever I struggled, whenever I was having a hard time, the message was essentially, you need to rely on God more. And that's such a blessing that you get to do that more than
Yeah.
have their husbands home helping their kids helping to put the kids to bed. And so that really ultimately, when I look back, was a really significant part of my deconstruction process.
Hmm.
Like, no, that's messed up.
Yeah.
But you
I
mentioned, go ahead.
Well, it's a podcast, so people can't see my real time reactions. But I had such like I had to like shake it off when you said some of that because like it's so gross.
Yeah.
One, I think like just the obvious spiritual bypassing, which is something that like working with clients around religious trauma like is such a helpful concept for them to be like where there's growth opportunities or where there's opportunity to like dig in and understand your belief system, you just slap a verse on it and don't do any of the growing. And like that's kind of how I describe spiritual bypassing.
Yeah.
And it's really helpful for people. But also just like how invalidating of your experience to be like, oh, somehow it's your fault. So we're victim blaming, like you're not trusting God enough. And then saying like your struggle is a gift, which is just like the weaponization of uh unhelpful human experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very painful. And I wasn't perfect either.
Mhm.
But yeah, you mentioned earlier that your deconstruction was sort of over 20 years. And it's interesting to look back on my own experience because I actually think that without knowing, there was some deconstruction attempting to happen.
Hmm.
But it was too, kind of all along the way for me. I remember being kind of the kid in youth group who was like asking a lot of hard questions. And I
Yeah.
remember the youth pastor, that's of course not the term we used, but essentially youth pastor, he would get a little annoyed with me. And
Hmm.
so I think there was this resistance inside of me all along that was
Yeah.
sort of like, wait a minute, this doesn't add up. And I remember needing like working definitions for things. I was like,
Yeah.
no, but what is grace? What do you mean? Or what is I can't even think of other concepts now. Like, what is eternal life? Like, what does that look like? What does that mean? Whereas other people didn't seem just sort of seem to take it in stride more than I could.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, deconstruction was sort of a long process without really knowing it, but it was really too risky. First of all,
Yeah.
I was risking my entire community and life. My parents are actually not very much involved with the cult anymore, but they
Hmm.
were, and I was
Yeah.
raised in it. So I was risking family. I was risking all of my friends. I was risking this like network of people that I knew all over the world by questioning. And also, it's when you question, when you have doubts, it's evidence of your faithlessness and
Right.
of your that there even could be like demonic influence. I was told that as I
Hmm.
was deconstructing. So really, on so many levels, it was too risky for me to deconstruct fully along the way. And so for me, deconstruction actually happened like hard and fast.
Yeah.
There was sort of a time, recently where it was like I couldn't play whack-a-mole anymore. They were just
Hmm.
popping up too much. And that beach ball that hold down under the water just came flying out.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting, and I had to go to therapy
Hmm.
to process everything that was happening in my life because I was deconstructing and divorcing at the same time. So
Sure.
essentially, like all of the structures and all of the givens in my life were no longer.
Yeah.
I remember at times feeling like almost like not quite derealization, but I was sort of like, what is real? What
Hmm.
what is my life? What do I hold on to? All of the things that I used to uh, claim as like little points of security were no longer there. And I was also initiating the divorce. And so at the same time that I was deconstructing and divorcing, many, many people were not happy with me.
Sure. Well,
Um,
this is maybe an unimportant question, but I'm curious.
sure.
What was like your experience finding a therapist who could address all of those moving parts?
That's a really good question. So, I've seen several therapists in my lifetime. The
Hmm.
first one I saw was actually for some disordered eating and body image struggles that I was going through back in college. So that was my first experience with therapy. Really great experience. And then talked to a therapist at some point because I was really struggling in my marriage. I didn't find that to be too helpful, unfortunately. Sometimes it's just not a good fit, but I
Yeah.
actually don't think that I quite knew how to be helped at that point because there was so much of that spiritual bypassing happening
Sure.
that the help that she was attempting to give me, I would pretty much just disqualify. Like,
Yeah.
she was a secular therapist, and so, okay, but you don't know that I'm supposed to be relying on God's grace alone. So I don't know
Sure.
that I can deal with what you're saying. And then to bring it to the here and now, we actually did some couples therapy after I said that I wanted a divorce. And we went through three people,
Hmm.
which was an interesting experience. The first one just kind of wasn't a good fit. Second one, I had an interesting experience where I told her that I was deconstructing and that I was really processing some trauma around my religious experience. And I didn't know she was a Christian therapist. My ex-husband had sort of selected her.
Sure.
And I had went in having my own individual therapy with her, and she chastised me
Oh no.
the way that a person in my cult would have. She said, "You need to let go of this of all of these questions and these doubts, and you need to let God take over your life, and you need to, I mean, it was like preaching at
Yeah.
me. So
Which
much
is
so, yeah,
bad
completely.
therapy. And
Mhm.
just, yeah, as a therapist, that bothers me. And as the religious trauma piece, it's like, yuck, that's so unhealthy.
I can't even think of a time that I've ever said to a client, and she was actually using her finger, like pointing her finger at me, saying, "You need to." I don't think I've ever done that to
Yeah.
any of my clients, both pre deconstruction or after.
Right.
It really rattled me. And so I knew that from then on, I needed to be with a secular therapist, that a Christian therapist would not work. I was at a point in my deconstruction at that point where I still said I believed in God because it felt a little safer to still do that.
Sure.
I identify right now as agnostic.
Hmm.
And so, if there is a God, me and him are taking a very long break. Um,
Sure.
but I knew that I needed to be with a secular therapist at that point, and I found someone who actually specialized in narcissistic abuse.
Okay.
And while she didn't have a lot of knowledge of religious trauma, I had personally taken some training at that point, both as a sort of layperson and as a therapist in religious trauma. And
Yeah.
so I said, "Hey, I think I actually need some help with understanding coercive control and narcissistic abuse, because I
Hmm.
think that was happening through the cult and also somewhat in my marriage."
Yeah.
And so I thought that that really sounded like a good fit. And I actually asked her up front if she would be willing to learn about religious trauma. There were other
Sure.
things in her profile, the religious trauma piece, but she was on board to learn.
Hmm.
And that is what really made a lot of the difference. So
Yeah.
she really became well acquainted with religious trauma. I sent her all of the sort of worksheets and handouts and things and videos to watch. And so that is something I think that people should know
Yeah.
about seeking therapy, is that if there is an area that you really need some specific help with, and for whatever reason you're not able to find a therapist who specifically works with that subject, first of all, probably find someone who does, if you can.
Yeah.
But um, if you're not able to, if your area has like a long waiting list or something for your specific need, you can actually be upfront with your clinician and say, "This is what I need help with. It looks like from your profile or from what I understand about you that you don't work a lot with this issue. Is this something you'd be willing to become educated about so that we
Yeah.
can work well together?"
Yeah. And I was going to highlight like that's so good of you as a client to advocate for yourself in that way and say like, hey, this is something that I want to get out of therapy.
Yeah,
Like, is that a thing that we can work together on? Can you do your work as the professional while I'm doing my work as a client? Which, like, right, totally appropriate. Like, I tell clients, I tell clients is more maybe on the side of medical help than
mm,
therapy help once they found me at least. But like, right, you need to advocate for yourself. Like clinicians,
yeah,
medical doctors, all these people have their own cognitive biases on how they like to work and the things they like to do. And so like making sure that you're like if you're paying for a service, that you're
right.
getting the service that you want.
Absolutely. Yeah, and also that clinician does have the right to say no,
Right.
if that's just sort of realistically not within their bandwidth at that time.
Yeah.
Then I would hope that at that point they would help you to find, or point you in the right direction to find what you need.
Hmm.
But it is something that you can absolutely ask for. And then also, of course, within the therapy experience as well, not just prior to finding a therapist, to continue to advocate for yourself as well,
Yeah.
um, and say, "Hey, like I'm not really a therapist who does a lot of like homework and assignments. It's just kind of not my jam." But
Yeah.
I will tell clients, like, if you're feeling like you need some more structure for how to grow between sessions, please let me know, and I'll be happy to
Right.
come up with something. Well, not happy,
Yeah.
but I'll do it.
Yeah. That's literally it's literally part of my informed consent for clients. Like if you're type A and you need like workbooks and homework. Like, I might not be the best therapist. I can do all
Right.
that stuff, but like if you want it every week, like, nah, that's not usually me. I throw like a ton of resources at people and I'm like, pick something and we'll go through it together. But like,
Yeah.
I'm not making worksheets up or anything like that.
Yeah.
Uh, which I think is good. I think it's helpful. I think it's good for clients to be upfront and again advocate for what they want and need. And I think it's
Yeah.
good for therapists. I got much more comfortable in that in my own practice rather than when I was doing agency work or anything else like that, where I could just be like, yeah, this is how I practice. So like, if you don't want that, I'll give you a list of other therapists. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been sort of an interesting part of my journey as a therapist and also as a human being who's really like going through a lot in recent
mhm,
years is like, and this is something I've worked with my therapist about, is that like, of course in the room with the client, we are in a certain role and that is, well defined and it's ethical to be in that role. And at the same time, we get to be authentic human beings too.
yeah,
And sometimes that is actually a part of what is beautiful and healing for a client. And that doesn't mean, of course, like I'm sharing my story all the
right,
time with clients. But, there's this type of therapy that we call like interpersonal process therapy, where a lot of the material that's processed in the room is actually like what's going on between the therapist and client. So
mhm,
that's a little bit of the work that I do, which requires me to be an authentic human being
right,
in the room. And then, of course, what happens between therapist and client is at least giving us some data about what's happening between client and their other, relationships. And so it's been interesting to kind of become more of my authentic self as a therapist as
yeah,
well. And that's been really a rewarding part of this journey.
yeah, for sure. I'm gonna do a hard left turn here.
Mhm.
Let's talk about sex because it's
Let's
what you like to work with.
talk.
I was I always tell couples like sex and money are the number one and number two things that get couples to come into therapy. So as a
Mhm.
marriage therapist, like that's my actual licensure. That's how I've done therapy from the get-go.
Yeah.
Um, it comes up often. I'm
Mhm.
curious a little bit in your personal experience, like what was the like I grew up around purity culture.
Yeah.
So for me, like sex was I had like this blank, almost a blank slate because I had next to no education, and what I was educated on was almost exclusively incorrect. Um, so then when I went to like undergrad and my master's and everything and learned about sexuality, like it was almost like I just approached it from a scientific perspective because I
Mhm.
had no background growing up. Like we didn't do purity culture ceremonies, like sex was so taboo, you just didn't talk about it
Right.
in the
Like we're
religious
not
groups
even going to teach purity culture. That's how taboo it is.
because we don't want you to think about it.
Right.
Um, so
That'll
like
work.
for me that was helpful in a sense, in a weird way, because like then as a marriage therapist, I just very easily went to the literature, I went to research, I went to like, okay, well, whatever the Bible is saying, sure, but like also here's
Mm,
this longitudinal study that has really high accuracy that's telling us like there's a healthy way to do this and you're not doing it that way.
yeah.
But I'm curious kind of what that was like for you building into like working not exclusively, but like having a niche around working with sex.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think, sometimes the way that we're raised really informs how we experience life. And then sometimes we really develop in spite of it.
Hmm.
And I think for me, it was the latter. Sex was so taboo in the group growing up. I mean, even like thoughts of sex and so on were really shamed and that kind of thing. So I have a similar experience in that I wasn't actually really taught purity culture in the same way that some people experienced it. It was just sort of this vacuum.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think I somehow escaped a lot of the personal impact from all of that. I'm still understanding why that is.
Hmm.
Um, but how that translates to my work with clients now is that I really do have an understanding of what it was like for sex to be so taboo, so, so much shame around it. And
Mhm.
I see the impact of purity culture with my clients who are either still in evangelical spaces or who have sort of moved away from them and are looking to heal in
Yeah.
their individually, but also, you know, in their sexual lives. And I see that all the time. The analogy I use is like, you know, for your whole life, you were told, don't go outside. It's too dangerous. It's too scary. You could get hit by a car. A bird could poop on you. You could get diseases. You're going to get sunburned. Like it's actually immoral to even consider going outside because of how risky it is and because of how dirty it is and so on. And you know, don't even look outside. Don't even consider it because then you're going to want it more. So there was really this sort of like systematically programmed fear response to shame. And so your nervous system learns to respond one way to this topic. And
Mhm.
then what happens is, oh, you have a committed partner, you're getting married. Okay, now you're married, you have someone you can go outside with. That makes it a little more acceptable. What do you mean you don't want to run out the door? Like,
Right.
what's wrong with you? You look, go, it's a beautiful day. Like, go explore all that there is to see outside. What do you mean you are having a hard time rushing to explore and to feel comfortable going outside? It's like, well, for your whole life, you were told that that was risky and dangerous and dirty and bad and so on. So I work a lot with within the paradigm of like the nervous system to
Mhm.
understand our reactions and our responses to sexual material. And, you know, a little tidbit of psychoeducation, I guess, if you will. But, you know, the sympathetic nervous system response, that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, is really an interrupter to the sexual excitation system, or, you know, our accelerator.
Yeah.
And so much of my work has to do with helping people to learn what's blocking their parasympathetic nervous system state, that rested, relaxed, you digest your food in this state, and you also experience arousal and orgasm in this
Mhm.
state. And so the religious messages actually are continuing to activate that sympathetic nervous system response. And so we have to work from like a cognitive place to really unpack these messages, and do they hold up against science? What do you think about the Bible being inerrant and infallible, and so on and so forth?
Mhm.
And really helping people to access that parasympathetic nervous system state. And but it's hard. It's hard for
Yeah.
many people.
Yeah, and I mean, the psychoeducation is great and spot on, but the I loved that analogy. I'm totally gonna steal that in the
Go for
future.
it.
But it's also like, right, sex around purity culture is brought up in a threatening way. Like, you're gonna get pregnant, or you're gonna get an STD, or
Mhm.
your future spouse won't like love you.
Yeah, or you
So
give yourself away and that kind of
all
thing.
all of that is threat, like, and your brain processes threat a certain way. So like that's where the fight or flight comes in. And so it's like, I don't know of a way to escape some of that stuff. Like, if you're being indoctrinated in this, like, you're gonna have to learn how to unpack some of it and learn a different way, because it's all fear based, it's all threat based in and around purity culture.
Yeah, and I actually do a lot of exposure therapy or systematic desensitization
Hmm.
with people to sort of help them to become more comfortable around this thing that was categorized as threatening for so long.
Yeah.
So it really is like a significant process. It
Yeah.
really is heavy, you know, full process to heal from this indoctrination. But that's, of course, not the only type of sex therapy that I do. There's lots of different aspects of the sexual relationship that I struggle with. And I just love seeing people experience shifts in their ways of thinking about sex. I find that
Hmm.
to be one of the most effective ways of helping people is, you know, actually, you don't just have to go from, you know, making out to a little bit of touching to intercourse to orgasm and you're done. There's actually more of a circular model
Yeah.
that we can use. Just little things like that, and watching people sort of have this shift in their understanding that then they can use in their daily lives. That's just a little example of it, but that is just one of the most rewarding things for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the like paradigm shifts. Like it's one thing I think to give people tools and techniques that are helpful. I'm going to nerd out on like family or systems therapy stuff a little
Yeah,
bit, but like we talk about like first order change, which is kind of behavioral change, second order change, which is like kind of like another person changing with you, and then third order change, which is like a belief system change. And so
right.
when we can do all of those things, like that's the change that's lasting. That's the change that's going to like stick with you, not just be like, oh, well, I got to go back to therapy every 6 months. Like
Yeah,
those are the things that like, oh no, like when we shift that belief system or the paradigm shifts, then our partner shifts with us or partners shift with us. And then we have the skills and the behaviors that are helpful. Like
right.
it's a totally different experience then.
Absolutely. Because when those core beliefs and those belief systems shift, then, the same behaviors aren't sort of manifesting from that. And so it's
Yeah.
really lasting change and really significant change, as you said.
Yeah. And I have had a couple sex educators on the podcast because I think one, around religious trauma, it's just super common because purity culture is toxic.
Hmm.
But two, like even for people who didn't grow up in religion, sex, like if you grew up in America, like sex is kind of still
Yeah,
a taboo topic. It's a weird, we talked about cognitive dissonance before. It's weird cognitive dissonance because like media is hypersexualized and yet there's almost no like useful or helpful information around the topic. So it's like throw sex in people's faces, but not in any sort of helpful or informative way.
totally. And then, I've had people who've come to me and they've been struggling for years and years, and they may not have grown up in religious spaces, but they still have nowhere to process these things. No
Yeah.
one to sort of give them any insight or help or education. And so, I've had people who's, sit down on my couch and they're like, we've been married for 7 years and we are struggling. And they just immediately start to cry because it's
Hmm.
like such a relief to have a space where we can actually talk about these things. And
Yeah.
that's part of why I love doing sex therapy.
Yeah. And I always think it's fascinating. I think I've been doing this for almost 15 years, which makes me feel old. But whenever I tell couples like this is something I've worked with before, and like this is something I've worked with earlier this week, like this isn't like a weird or unique or like you're not crazy, you're not bad or broken. Like this is a common experience for people.
Totally. Yeah, it's such a relief. Like, okay,
Mhm.
wait, I might have a shot at like processing this in a helpful way with someone who like knows what they're doing. Oh my gosh, that changes
Yeah,
everything.
for sure. And you talked about accelerators, so I'm gonna jump and make an assumption that we're going off of like the Emily Nagoski model, which is the dual control model, accelerators and decelerators.
Yep.
Basically, your brain has a gas pedal and a brake pedal,
Mhm.
um, and a parking brake, I would say. And for some people, like there's a lot of pressure on that gas pedal or the parking brake's on. And so no matter how hard you hit the gas, it's very hard to get going.
Absolutely. Yeah. And those religious messages step on the brake pedal significantly.
Yeah.
Those, that systematic fear response that was programmed into you in so many different ways, implicitly, explicitly, in the way that your parents might have responded to you as a young child who's exploring their genitals, which is a
Hmm.
very normal and actually important part of human
Yep.
sexual development. The way that your parent responded to you, sometimes those things are so embedded in our psyche that they actually continue to step on our brake pedal, even if you cognitively buy into the idea that now sex is appropriate and
Right.
acceptable once you're married or whatever. And so, really unpacking all that can be stepping on people's brake pedals is
Hmm.
such an important part of all of it. So, yeah, exactly like you said, that understanding the brake pedal piece is huge.
Yeah. Um, I'm gonna guess our experience is a little different because our gender.
Mhm.
Because for me, like working as a dude, like that's been nice as a marriage therapist because a lot of people pick me because like I hear a lot of like my husband doesn't want to go to therapy or my partner doesn't want to my male partner doesn't want to go to therapy. So like I'm always like just show him my picture. Like I got long hair, I got a beard, like I'm not scary. Come on in. Um but the flip side of that is like working with so much like pornography and like when I was a Christian, like I had to stop taking clients with porn addiction because it was like filling up my entire caseload, which was not what I wanted to be working with.
Right.
Um and that's fascinating after you've deconstructed to be like, oh, yeah, I don't care. Like, Watch porn. It's not that bad for you.
Yeah.
Ethically, consume it from an ethical source, but like,
Right.
yeah, I don't know. I just read a study the other day that said the only damage that's done with pornography, like a meta-analysis, was people who have religious beliefs that say
Mhm.
pornography is bad. It's like, right, like the cognitive dissonance is the harmful piece.
Yes, I totally relate with that shift in understanding that you're referencing as well. I had a client who felt so relieved the other day because he was talking about his masturbation habits and he just felt so much shame around them. And he said, "Do I have an addiction? Like, is this something that's wrong with me? I just can't seem to help stop." And of course, with any behavior that is sort of compulsive, we want to look at its function and or
Mhm.
dysfunction. Um, but his habits were completely within the realm of normal. And
Yeah,
it was just such a relief for, someone who has the expertise to say, give him the stamp of approval, like, you're not broken, nothing
right.
is wrong with you. This is completely normal and there are benefits to this.
Yeah,
And so, whoa, that just changes everything.
yeah.
That
Isn't
shifts.
it funny? Isn't it funny to have like some of these conversations as like our everyday job, thinking of like how of a conservative and upbringing you had?
Totally.
I
I
was,
actually have you mentioned that you heard me on another podcast, and I actually, really got some significant backlash from people that I still know in
mhm,
the cult. There are a lot of people that were not happy with me, and I'm sure they won't be happy with me for this one.
yeah,
But that has been a significant part of my healing. Is I feel like deconstructing and divorcing in a context where divorce is not acceptable has actually really thrown me into this like codependency recovery journey where I have had to
sure,
become so okay with being different and with not having people's approval, and not having the acceptance that I once used to in a cult.
yeah,
And so it's an interesting process for me just existing as myself, both
yeah,
as a parent and a human being and someone who does podcasts and someone who, practices as a therapist and a coach as well. That I'm somewhat, I'm on social media and so on. And so like people can see what I'm doing. And
mhm,
then having to deal with some resistance to that used to really throw me into a tailspin, and I would experience shame and like really significantly would throw off my mental health for a while.
yeah,
And so now doing it, I just feel so much like peace because I can do these things. I can put myself out there. I can be different than conservatives and people who have a different belief system than me, and I'm okay.
yeah,
It's pretty wonderful. It feels pretty
yeah.
good.
It's very freeing, and I have this conversation with clients often because I advertise as working specifically with religious trauma. But
Yeah.
it's I have to remind myself of like the journey to get there, because where I'm at right now is like, right, like that pushback or that negative feedback from like religious people like just fuels me. Like I'm like, yeah, like I'm not you anymore, and it's so
Yeah.
much better over here.
Yeah.
Um, but for people who are deconstructing, it's very scary. So I have to remind
Totally.
myself of like being like, hey, it's freeing, is like at that there's a process, there's a journey to get into that point. But like, yeah, just the relief around like letting a lot of that stuff go and being able to exist and have grace for yourself and self-compassion is like so nice.
So nice.
And I don't know, we don't have to talk about this if you don't want to. But it's, as a parent, for me, like it's been very freeing to be like, right, like that was, I would say that was the start of like the final last gasp of being a Christian, was having a kid and being like, I'm not teaching them like original sin. I'm not teaching them Noah's Ark. Like that's not true. Like I know, like
Yes.
I can't pass that on to another generation. And so like that for me was like, right, this is where I just admitted, because it was for my kid instead of for me, like this isn't healthy.
Well, I totally understand that. I do have a different experience in that, my ex-husband being a full-timer, um,
Sure.
there really was not a lot of space for me to push back, and push away.
Mhm.
And so I I'm really grappling with this now, even in my therapy journey, but I raised my kids in a fundamentalist way for
Hmm.
a while. And they're only 8, 6, and 4. And so it's not like, the damage can't be undone kind of thing. But my ex-husband is still fundamentalist, and so he will be
Yeah.
raising them that way. And we've already had some interesting conversations, and I have to be really mindful of, like, it's not my job to force them or attempt to even pull them toward what I believe.
Yeah.
It's really my job to be a safe space for them to process what
Hmm.
is coming up for them, those inevitable questions
Yeah.
and those inevitable struggles. And so right now they do believe in Noah's Ark, for example,
Sure.
uh, as far as I know. But I love anytime they ask me, like, why don't you believe in God, Mom? And it's sort of like,
Hmm.
okay, here's an opportunity where I get to be authentic and I get to at least tell them in a child appropriate way, sort of like what I went through and what I struggled with, and that it's okay to not know.
Yeah. And I think even just it's very not fundamentalist to have a choice and to
Mhm.
like be aware that there are options. So
Yeah,
like it's not an option for a little kid to think like believe this or the other option is hell. Like that's not an actual option. And so even just I think having the perspective or having people around who are like you can
yeah,
you can believe that or you cannot believe that and like either one is okay. And that's
totally.
very freeing, I think.
Yeah, I'm big on analogies. And so the
Hmm.
analogy that I use is like, imagine if I told my children that they had to keep their room spotless at all times, or else, I would, I almost can't even say it because it's so horrible, but the analogy really works in that if they don't keep their room spotless at all times, I will hold their hand to the stove.
Hmm.
Like, I will burn them for the rest of their existence. Like,
Yeah.
holy wow. And so of course they're going to keep their room spotless, even though they're actually not, because that's not possible.
Right.
They're children, they're human beings. But is it really a choice, is the point that you made.
Yeah.
And I use that analogy with sort of understanding what happened to me,
Hmm.
and also the impact that that can have on children,
Yeah.
um, a lot to understand there actually wasn't a choice.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I hate the phrase unevenly yoked and I hate when I have to bring it up. But like it is an interesting process, I think, for couples who don't deconstruct. I don't want to say together because I think it's an individual process most of the time, but there's overlap for a lot of couples
Mhm.
that I've seen, like coming out of COVID. I've talked about politics too in the United States, like being a pretty big thing where like some of the mass exodus that's happening from churches, like some couples are going through it together. And then it is not like insurmountable, but I would say stickier when it's not happening at the same time or the same pace.
Yeah. Oh, it was, it did not go well for me to be, deconstructing with someone who very much was not. And I think actually he became even more entrenched in his
Yeah.
belief system, sort of as a resistance to my resistance. And so
Yeah.
that was very much a part of what was so hard.
Yeah. Which is for people who don't work with it, like not common, a possible outcome of cognitive dissonance. Like you can't just try and bang someone over the head with it until their cognitive dissonance goes away, because sometimes the way that the brain soothes itself is to dig in harder on whatever that belief is, which
Right.
happens a lot with conspiracy theories,
Mhm.
um, which are common among fundamentalists.
Interesting.
Separate topic for a different podcast. Um, Shifting a little bit again, I always like to ask kind of like what are you reading, what are you watching? That can be like professional or
Mhm.
kind of like recreational, both, I guess.
Yeah.
um,
That's a good question. I unfortunately don't get a lot of time to read. I'm a huge reader, but like most of my books are just like on Audible, and I don't
Sure.
retain a ton of information from Audible. But a book that I'm certain that you have heard of or read is Leaving the Fold by
Hmm.
Winnell, Dr. Winnell. What's her first name?
Yep.
Marianne?
Marlene.
Marlene, yeah, yeah. And that book, of course, was like extremely pivotal in my whole journey. And I'm still doing some of like the inner child work that
Sure.
book does. And so that is sort of a professional and personal read.
Yeah.
I read a lot of books on sex therapy. You mentioned Emily Nagoski, like Come As You Are, if anyone's looking
Hmm.
for like kind of a beginner's intro to learning about some helpful paradigm shifts with sex,
Yeah.
that is a great place to start. And I read a little bit more these days for pleasure. I'm really, if I do get a chance to read, because part of my religious trauma is that I felt like I had to be productive at all times in order to feel worthy and valuable.
Sure.
And so I attempt now, even as a way of like practicing some self-care, to do things that are explicitly not productive.
Yeah.
And so just like, even if I were to like lay outside in the sun or something, I would always want to be like, reading or working on paperwork or doing something that was semi-productive or at least helped me to squelch the anxiety that came up about not being productive. So
Hmm.
I attempt to push back against that now, reading for pleasure. And so I'm rereading Unbroken by I think Laura Hillenbrand, but I'm not great with remembering names. It's a World War II
Sure.
nonfiction book, but it's a really great read.
Yeah. Yeah, I struggle. And I ask this because I think I'm curious what other therapists are doing, but I think it's an interesting topic too. It's a good way to get extra resources out. But like
Mhm.
that balance between in our free time or our time not seeing clients, how do we balance like professional work and like, because a lot of us do this work because we're genuinely interested in it.
Absolutely.
Um, but there's a balancing act of like, especially when you're working with something of a heavy topic like trauma. Um, that can be draining to engage with it too much outside of the
Yes.
work. Like it's helpful to get information and different perspectives, but also there's a balancing act to not do too much because that can contribute to burnout or just a mismanagement of overall stress.
Yeah, and I would say that that's actually what you're describing has actually been a really significant part of my healing journey overall, is just being more sort of in tune with my body and
Hmm.
those signals of burnout, and sort of like what am I inclined to do right now? Not just like what should I be doing or what do I need to do? But like what is my body actually communicating to me about what I would like to eat, about what I would like to do or not do?
Yeah.
And when you've been outsourcing that for so long to, all of these external standards or expectations or shoulds, if you will,
Hmm.
it's very challenging to reconnect with self.
Yeah.
So in a very, as a very broad stroke top, idea, that is a significant part of my healing journey as well, is that reconnection with self, with
Hmm.
authentic self, finding out who that even is and what she wants and what she's about and
Yeah.
what feels good to me and to my body.
Yeah. And that journey is complex and I would say never really ends. There's not an
No.
end point. We're constantly changing, but I also super rewarding. Like that's the work that I think as a therapist is really fun to like go along with people. And when I say something like it's an honor to do therapy with people, like that's the journey that is so like, yeah, it's special to be helpful in any way that I can in that process, but also like to witness or to see people discovering that or like establishing it maybe for the first time or doing some of that work. Like it's very cool work.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, it was actually both very hard and also helpful to be a therapist, a practicing
Hmm.
therapist, while my life was rapidly and radically changing and while it was very painful. And I think part of what you're noting is what was so helpful to me is that I would go to work some days, like wiping tears away from my eyes as I open my laptop and get on a call, a virtual
Sure.
session with someone. And then I get to see the resilience of humanity and the
Yeah.
beauty in it. And sometimes there would be real, tangible progress. And so I would go from this place of feeling hopeless to, wait a minute, I'm actually walking alongside someone that has hope and
Mhm.
that has, tenacity and that has resilience and strength. And it was really challenging, to be frank, being a therapist while my life was falling apart.
Yeah.
But it was also a gift to me as well.
Yeah. I'm always inspired by the work my clients are doing as well. Like not to be cliche, but like I learned so much from my clients and they're coming to, you know, get my help, but like it's a two-way street. Like I think I can't imagine how to do good therapy where you're not as a therapist also affected by it.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
um it's interesting though, like with the deconversion. I think for me, once I was like ready to be like, right, I don't believe this stuff, and I'm an atheist now. Um, like that was my more authentic self. Like I think my deconstruction took so long that like
Mm.
it was just waiting for my brain to finally like be like, yep, no, we're done with that. And then it was like, I imagine the image I have in my head is like those people who pull a dinner cloth out from under all
Yeah.
the plates and silverware and everything stays put. Like that's kind of what it was like for me. Where it was like, all right, I'm an atheist now. And then I was like, oh, this is so much like nicer and easier and better and healthier. It's like I could apply all the things I taught my clients in a like much more genuine, easy, real way. Like I had been doing so much work to stay a Christian that once I let that go, I was like, oh, yeah, no, this makes more sense.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that just like hits the nail on the head for me in my own experience. And I think when we are operating from more of an authentic place as a therapist, we're better clinicians,
Yeah,
um,
for sure.
better people, better human beings, and that we're existing in an authentic way, but also practicing better as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Hallie, it's been awesome.
Thanks for having
Uh,
me.
if people want to find out more about you or find out about your work, where do they go?
Yeah, so you can head to my Instagram to start because I have had a really challenging time getting a website up and running, but it should be up and running very, very soon.
Sure.
But my Instagram handle is the Deconstructing Sex Therapist.
Yeah.
And I'm doing a lot of really like exciting things right now in my therapy practice. I'm starting to run some groups for women with low desire
Hmm.
and also for people who are looking to heal in a communal space from religious trauma. And then I think I'm going to launch another one in the works as well, which is a little bit of like preparing your sex life for having a baby.
Sure.
And so I'm running some groups in my therapy practice, which is based in Michigan. And
Hmm.
so, if you're in Michigan, I can see you there. But outside of Michigan, I am doing some coaching as well,
Nice.
and that'll be sort of through my website. And so
Yeah.
you can find me there as soon as it's up. But to start, you can go to the Deconstructing period sex therapist on Instagram.
Yeah, which we will have linked in the show notes, and I highly recommend like your I don't like social media. I think I'm bad at it, but like your you shared a lot of personal stuff in your journey, and I remember there was like a 3-part post you made that was pretty intensely personal, and that was when I was like, oh, I got to get Hallie on the podcast because this is like exactly the stuff that we talk about. So very real, very genuine in your posting, which I think is so helpful for people to see.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll have that in the show notes, and depending on when this episode goes live, we might be able to circle back and get your website listed as well.
Sounds good. I'll keep
Uh,
in touch.
yeah, and all my stuff, as always, is available at wellnesswithjared.com, and that's my social media handle for Instagram and YouTube as well. Hallie, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
And to all our wonderful listeners out there, thanks once again for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.